Hello, friends, and welcome back to the podcast. Today, we're joined by a brand new guest who wrote a book that is, I think, by far one of the most impactful books I've read in a long time. His name is John Philip Newell, and his book is called Sacred Earth, Sacred Soul. And so, John Philip, JP, as your friends call you, welcome to the podcast, my friend. It's an honor to have this time with you.
Thank you, Glenn. Good to be with you.
Thank you. So, JP, before we jump into your book, maybe take a few moments to tell us a little bit about yourself. I'm relatively new to you and your work, as I mentioned before we hit the record button, and I know a lot of our listeners are kind of in the same boat. So maybe tell us about you. Who are you? What do you do? Some of the highlights of your journey.
Yeah, well, I describe myself as a wandering teacher in an ancient tradition. In the Celtic world, especially in the Middle Ages, there were many wandering Celtic teachers, and they were in the Middle Ages. They were called Scotus vagans, that is, wandering Scots. And these wandering spiritual teachers were free from ecclesiastical control, which meant that they were not out to teach truth that had been dispensed from above in terms of ecclesiastical hierarchy, but they saw themselves as trying to give voice to what is in the human soul and trying to set free awarenesses in the hearts and minds of their listeners. And this was a tradition that deeply honored the sacredness of what is deepest in every human being and honored the sacredness of the earth. So I'm part of this ancient tradition that is enjoying a resurgence. I think often teachings appear again when we need them, and this moment in time, especially in our relationship with earth, this is a spiritual tradition that speaks very profoundly into this moment in time and the urgency of coming back into a true and spiritual relationship with the earth and what is deepest in one another and all people. So that's the sort of tradition in which I see myself. I'm based in Edinburgh here with my wife. This is where we've reared our children. But I'm Canadian by birth. I began on your side of the Atlantic, and although my mother was Scottish and my father was Irish, so the Celtic world has been very much a part of my ancestry, and it's the culture and tradition and spiritual wisdom from which I draw. So I'm a wandering teacher. A lot of my teaching is in the United States and Canada, and then also on this side of the Atlantic, especially on the little holy island of Iona in Scotland, out in the Western Isles. It's seen as the birthplace of Christianity for Scotland from about the 6th century onwards. So every year I lead pilgrimage weeks on the island of Iona, to which people come from all over the world. My postal address is in Edinburgh, but the address of my heart is the island of Iona in the Hebrides. Yeah.
Now, when you talk about how this is your path, has it always been your path, or did you grow up in a different kind of tradition and then you kind of deconstructed, for lack of a better word, to find this path, or has this always been your path?
Yes, I did grow up in another tradition, a conservative evangelical household. My father was a minister in that tradition, and it is a tradition that I'm grateful to have grown up in, to the extent that it is a tradition that encouraged me, nurtured me to pay very close attention to the heart. It was a heart-oriented tradition, and I'm grateful for that. And sometimes during interviews like this, one of the things I love about interviews like this is that I never quite know what I'm going to be asked, and I don't often quite know how I'm going to respond, because sometimes questions come that I haven't thought of before. And when that occurs, I just need to open my mouth and see what comes. And sometimes it's pretty illuminating and interesting for me as well. And a number of years ago, I was giving some talks with Barbara Brown Taylor, another spirituality teacher. And the focus of our talks was very much on what we have to learn from other great spiritual traditions. And so in my own talks, I've been drawing on Jewish wisdom and Muslim wisdom and Buddhist wisdom. And at the end of the talks, we were being interviewed, and the interviewer said, "So John Philip, tell me what has most influenced your approach to interspiritual or interfaith relationship and dialogue?" And I hadn't quite thought through that question before, and so I found myself saying, "Well, I think I have been most influenced by my evangelical upbringing," which was a slightly surprising place to go. It's not, I think, where many would typically go in terms of understanding what would lead one into interspiritual dialogue and relationship. But by that I meant, when I meet a new rabbi, or when I meet a new imam or a native teacher, I first and foremost, I realize I pay attention to their heart. I mean, I'm interested in the realm of ideas and philosophical reflection and perspective, but I know that what I do sort of instinctively, and I hope with the sort of reverential stance, is to pay attention to the heart of the other. And I think it was my evangelical upbringing that gave me that close attentiveness to the heart and to this really radically personal sense of relationship with the world, in that it focuses on a sense of personal relationship with the one from whom we've come, the one beyond names, but the one that we call God in the Christian tradition. So that was my beginning, and I never fully signed up, as it were, to the theology or the doctrine of that tradition. And I came to Scotland to study theology in the mid-1970s, came from Canada. And two things happened in Edinburgh that very profoundly shaped the unfolding course of my life in terms of spiritual tradition and theological perspective. And one was meeting George MacLeod, and he was the founder of the modern day Iona community, and he oversaw the rebuilding of the 12th, 13th century abbey on Iona. It was in ruins at that stage in the late 1930s. And he was committed to a vision of rebuilding that sacred site, not quite knowing how it was going to be, how the building itself was going to be used, but knowing that we needed to rebuild or reclaim the Celtic vision that was so deeply part of that island and its history. And so I met George MacLeod when I was in my early 20s. He was in his early 80s. And I heard him speak publicly here in Edinburgh. And when I heard him, I mean, he was the first Christian teacher that I had heard who was speaking about the sacredness of the earth, He was speaking even at that stage in the 1970s about our need to come into true relationship with the earth, about organic farming and so on. I also heard him speak about the non-violence of Jesus as as pointing to the essential way of true relationship between us as individuals, but also between us as nations. And I mean, I came away from that talk thinking, I need somehow to get close to this man. I found that he was speaking what my soul was yearning for, and I didn't even quite know before the talk how deeply I was yearning for these themes. And I was blessed to be given opportunity shortly after that to get to know him and to open my heart and my mind to the vision that he was trying to articulate. So that was a major influence in my path, and also around the same time coming across a collection of prayers from the Celtic world, prayers that had been passed down in the oral tradition for hundreds of years, that gave voice to my soul. And these were prayers for the rising of the sun and the setting of the sun, at the birth of a child, at the death of loved one, at the kindling of the morning fire and its smothering or covering at night. And these were prayers that belonged to the natural and to nature and to the cycle of the seasons. And they were prayers that made my soul breathe in a way that no prayer tradition had done for me before that. So those were formative experiences for me, and have deeply shaped what I am and what the vision that I'm trying to serve today.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing that background. And that gives me, and I think probably our listeners too, just a lot of hope, because I love the origins of your story, that it began in that conservative evangelical world. Like I said to you before, that's where mine began. That's where a lot of our listeners began. And I love too how you said about how you listened to George MacLeod, right? That was his name, George MacLeod.
Yes.
And how something in your soul like longed for whatever it was that he was sharing. And I had that similar experience with Alexander John Shaya. I met him at the Wild Goose Festival, which is like a kind of a spiritual gathering that happens in North Carolina every year. He was speaking about his work, and I just sat there listening to this man. I'm like, I don't know what he's talking about, really, because it was all very foreign to me. But I'm like, something inside of me is like, I need this, and so I just followed it, and I read more of his stuff. I was able to get more connected with him. He shared other things with me, and now like I'm in this place that's much different than my origins. But like you said, I still have an appreciation for where I came from, because although a lot of the stuff I've moved way beyond, there are those things like an appreciation for the heart, like you said, appreciation for the soul, for the spirit, like all that kind of language was very important to me growing up. Although it looks much different for me now, the language is still very important for me. So thank you. Yeah. So your book, it's called Sacred Soul. The subtitle is Celtic Wisdom for Reawakening to What Our Souls Know and Healing for the World. I read that subtitle. I'm like, that's a big promise for a book. But for our listeners, it does deliver. So definitely go and pick it up. But there's a lot jammed into that statement. And I think maybe a really good place for us to start is something that I'm trying to kind of wrap my mind around in this season of my life is, what exactly is Celtic wisdom? Like, I understand some of the differences between like Western Christianity and Eastern, like that kind of language, but where does Celtic Christianity or Celtic wisdom kind of fit into the mix?
Yeah. Well, it's Celtic spirituality is a modern term, but we use it to refer to a very distinct stream within early Christianity in the Celtic world. So as early as the 2nd century, as I explore in the book, as early as the 2nd century, we find Christian teachers in the Celtic world are articulating an understanding of the Christ mystery in ways that are quite distinct from or different from the mainstream of Mediterranean Christianity, and especially from the 4th century, when Mediterranean Christianity becomes the religion of empire. And Celtic teachers, certainly from the 4th century onwards, become a thorn in the side of imperial Christianity, because they challenge that marriage between power and religion that happened in the 4th century and following. So we find teachers in the Celtic world emerging from as early as the 2nd century, and something of a golden age in the 6th century, for instance, when significant figures like Saint Bridget and Saint Patrick and Saint Columba emerge in the Celtic world. And by the Celtic world, I mean, at that stage, the Celtic nations really spanned the whole of Middle Europe, ranging from as far east as Turkey and as far west as the Atlantic coastline of Spain, and then taking in places like Gaul, ancient France, and the Gallic nation of France, taking in the Gaelic-speaking countries of Scotland, Wales, Cornwall, Ireland, and there are many distinct emphases that emerge in teachers that come out of the Celtic world over these centuries. But the two primary themes that really distinguish this stream of Christian spirituality from the dominant Mediterranean or imperial religion stream is the belief that what is deepest in every human being is of God. So from very early on, this tradition challenges the Mediterranean Christian doctrine of original sin, which has dominated so much of Western Christian thought. This doctrine that has been used to give the impression that what is deepest in us or what is most original in us is opposed to God rather than being of God. So one of the earliest teachers that we have written material from is someone like Pelagius in the 4th century, who said, for instance, that when we look into the face of a newborn child, we are looking into the face of God, freshly born among us. And so a consistent focus on what is deepest in us being of God rather than opposed to God. And of course, this has enormous implications. It influences nearly every other aspect of a spiritual theological tradition, to start with that of Godness deep within every human being. The second major emphasis, and it's directly related to the first, but it is a sort of distinct theme that emerges early on, and that is a sense of the sacredness of earth and a sense of sacredness of the creatures and every living being. So holiness in this tradition has from the very beginning been about wholeness. It's been about living in true relationship with the sacredness that is in you, that is deep in me and every person that I encounter. It's inviting me to pay attention to the of Godness or the sacredness that is a birthright of every human being. And what it's asking me in my relationship with you or in any person that I meet is, how can I in my words, how can I in my actions reverence that sacredness in you? And how can I be part of liberating it? How can I be part of allowing it to be born anew or born again, to use Jesus's language? And it's a tradition that has has had this alertness to the sacredness of the earth and sacredness of the seasons. And that's part of what makes it a tradition that is enjoying a resurgence now, because I think its language and its vision speaks right into the urgency of what we're being called to do, and that is to come back into true relationship with the earth. That the earth as we know it may survive, may be our children's inheritance.
That's beautiful. And when I listen to you talk and I read like the stories in your book, and it just seems like that just seems so much more Jesus-like, for lack of a better word, to me, than just what I was raised with. I mean, even just thinking about the whole topic of original sin. Like I told you before we hit record about that experience I had with my daughter in the NICU. And just I'm steeped in this theology. This is all I ever knew. But then when I'm staring at my daughter and she grabs my pinky, something in me just broke, and it's like this cannot possibly be right, and you have to figure out what this is. Like, I had all these degrees and I've taken all these classes, read all these books about this particular thing, but inside I was like, that just can't be right. And when I hear you talk about this, I'm like, that just seems so much more like Jesus to me. And I didn't see it when I was deep in all the education, deep in all the teaching, but now that I've kind of stepped out of that and I'm kind of observing from a different point of view, it just makes so much more sense.
Yeah. I mean, we've Western Christianity ended up sort of clothing Jesus, or cloaking him in many doctrines, and many of them don't bear true relationship with the heart of his teaching, the heart of his life, and his being. And one of them is this doctrine of original sin. I mean, this is not a Jewish teaching. And Jesus was speaking from a sort of deep truthfulness to the real heart of his tradition, which saw the blessedness that is deep in the newborn child. And the subtitle of the book, that fairly long-winded subtitle that you read out, awakening to what our souls know, and being part of the healing of the world. This is my experience, and in a sense, it is my sort of measuring rod in my own life and in my own teaching. I mean, I regard the births of my 4 children as the most sacred moments of my life. In their faces, I could glimpse something of the light from which all life has come. In their skin, I could smell something of the freshness and purity of life's origins. And this is something that I believe the human soul knows. And so many people, when they read this particular expression of Christian wisdom, will say to me things like, well, I knew it. I mean, I have a wonderful story that I think I tell in the book, of giving a talk in Virginia many years ago on some of the themes of the Celtic tradition, and especially speaking, I think I was speaking about that phrase from the prologue to John's Gospel, which speaks of the true light that enlightens every person coming into the world. And at the end of the talk, a woman in her 80s came very purposefully up the central aisle of the church with a copy of my book, Listening for the Heartbeat of God, in which I had explored some of these themes. And she was coming up the central aisle so purposefully that the naughty boy in me thought, I think she's going to hit me over the head with that book.
Here we go.
And but I was quite wrong. And when she got up to the front, she said, I want to show you what I wrote in this book after reading it. And she opened the front cover, and I saw that she had written, I knew it, I knew it, I knew it. No. And, I so often wish I had asked her for that copy, because think she said, she gave such simple expression to what our experience is when we hear ancient wisdom that has been neglected or hasn't. We may never have been taught it, we may never have heard it, but when we hear some of this wisdom, our deepest response is,
Yep.
I knew it.
Yep.
And I one of the reasons I would love to have her copy of my book sitting on my desk here would be to remind me that whenever I'm writing or whenever I'm teaching, my job is not to be trying to put forward truths that are not already in the heart of the listener. My role as writer, teacher, and our role for one another in true relationship is to awaken and is to set free what is already of God in the heart of the other.
Yeah, and I think that's, I mean, when I read your book and like I listen to like Alexander John Shaya, even like Rob Bell, he's really evolved very far from where he used to be. And I listen to teachers like you. I come to it's like this amazing revelation, but at the same time, I'm like, this isn't anything new. Like, it's not like, this isn't like rocket science. Like, this isn't like any kind of deep theological teaching. It's just like, oh, like, how did I not see that before? Like, of course, And I think that's the mark, I think, of a good teacher, is that you're blowing the dust off of something that's there, but it's just been covered up for so long.
Yeah.
So you've got a chapter. I'm gonna mess up this person's name, so help me out here. But there's a
Yeah,
chapter on Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. I didn't get that right. How do I say it?
No, not bad. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin.
There you go.
Yeah.
Yes.
Pierre, yeah. Pierre is his Christian name, of course, and Teilhard is his family name. And
Teilhard
de Chardin refers to that part of France that his family was from. Yeah.
Well, I like the way you say it much better than the way I say it. Teilhard, but it's hard to say which chapter. Like in the book, you have, I think there's 9 different people that you explore, and this one was definitely, I think, one of my favorites. But there's a quote in here that I wanted to read real quick for our listeners, and then just ask you to respond to it. It's a quote you said that's from the end of his life. It says, he said, Christianity is reaching the end of one of the natural cycles of its existence. After what will soon be 2,000 years, Christ must be born again. And then you say, in that born again Christianity, he said, Christ will no longer be seen as a deserter of the earth. He will be seen as a lover of the earth and at one with the earth. And I think that's so beautiful. And again, it awakens something inside of me that's like, yes, of course. But my question is, like, this seems like such a daunting task. And so I guess the question is, what can our listeners do? What can I do to begin this rebirth of Jesus in the world? Because for those of us, especially like in the US, in the South, where I live for sure, it very often feels like that separation between the physical and the spiritual, the disdain that we're often told that God has for the physical, his desire to destroy it in the end times, all these different things. It feels such a great mindset that's very cemented into place. And so talk to us, like, practically speaking, if my role is to almost like midwife this rebirth into the world, like where do I even begin? Like, what does it look like for me on an everyday basis, raising my families, somebody working a 9-to-5 job? Like, how do you do this?
Yeah,
that's a big question.
Great
a lofty question.
Well, and a really important one. So, one of the things that someone like Teilhard, but all of the great teachers in this stream are very focused on the mystery of the incarnation as right at the very heart of our Christian inheritance. And of course, the incarnation is all about the oneness of heaven and earth, of spirit and matter, of the divine and the human. What have we done with this sort of radical doctrine at the heart of our Christian inheritance? We've ended up, in many cases, saying, oh, it applies to one,
Mm.
to Jesus. And then we see Jesus as an exception to humanity, or as somehow in opposition to what is deepest in every newborn child, instead of seeing him as the revelation or the disclosure of what is deepest in you and in every human being. So this, the word revelation comes from the Latin root revelare, which means to lift the veil. So Jesus, in the thinking of someone like Teilhard, but consistently in the Celtic world, Jesus is seen as lifting the veil to show us what is deepest in us, in every human being. So this has radical implications for how we are to view ourselves and how we can view one another, and every man and every woman. And it allows us to see Christ not as an exception to the human mystery, but as this disclosure. And one of the things that's said in the Celtic world is that we suffer from soul forgetfulness. That is, we've forgotten who we are. We've forgotten who we truly are. And part of that soul forgetfulness is represented in something like the doctrine of original sin, to see that what is deepest in us is opposed to God, is to forget the unspeakable beauty and glory of who we are, made of God. So how do we apply this vision? And there are a number of ways that are important to me, and that I'm trying to be part of in my life and work. So one is to if we suffer from soul forgetfulness, and if we've been raised in a culture and indeed a religion often that does not help awaken our awareness of what is deepest within us, then we need to keep sort of remembering our true essence. And that's why some of the teachers in this tradition speak of Jesus as our memory. He comes to awaken us to who we are. So what are the ways in which I, on a daily basis, can remember who I am, and can remember what is deep within every person I meet, every person I encounter? And so for me, one of the important daily practices is a time of prayerful meditation every morning. Usually, in my case, as around the time the sun is rising. I mean, this has been a sacred moment in the 24-hour cycle for all great spiritual traditions. It's a sort of awakening time. So I sit in silence, gazing towards the eastern sky in Edinburgh. And of course, the rising of the sun is a lot later in the winter than it is in the summer. we're so far north. But that's a sacred discipline for me. And I use a very simple form of breathing meditation, in which I allow the natural intake of breath and out breath to form the rhythm and the focus. And I allow myself to pause at the end of the out breath and to remember that what is deepest in me is of the beauty of God. That's not in any sense to have an inflated sense of myself. I mean, it's quite the opposite. I think this is the path of humility that Jesus invites us into, to die to what is false in me, and to return again and again to the truth of who I am, made of God, and therefore to return to the wisdom of God that is within us as our birthright, to return to wisdom that is within us, deeper than any ignorance of what we've done. It's to return to the creativity of God deep in our soul, which is deeper than any barrenness in our lives. So that practice is an important one for me. And I think when in the past, when I was first beginning to develop this discipline of daily prayerful meditation, of remembering who I am, made of God, I would sometimes, of course, be tempted on a busy schedule morning to think, oh, I don't have time for half an hour of silent prayer meditation. But what I discovered is that if I actually neglect that personal discipline, then the day goes downhill for me. Then I live, I'm more inclined to live in a forgetfulness, a forgetting of what I am. So that's important, and I cherish that time individually. I love to be able to meditate with others as well. I mean, I think, and I think this is part of what Jesus invites us into in teachings. If we're two or three, are gathered. I think that there's something deeper and richer, stronger happens when we can find others with whom to be in remembering mode and being renewed through simple practices of prayer and silence and attentiveness. And in the Celtic world, there's this prizing of what's called the two scriptures. One is the little book, the book of scripture, physically little, and the other is seeing the sacred text of the earth, the sacred text of the universe, which is referred to as the big book through which God is speaking. And the discipline of listening within both those sacred texts of God, listening to them sort of in stereo, as it were, to hear both the sort of intimate expressions of the divine that come through scripture and that address often who we are in relationship, who we are to be in relationship with those who are hungry, with those who are poor. And then to listen to the big sort of expansive expressions of God in the unfolding universe. The Celtic tradition has really loved, especially John's Gospel, the opening words of John's Gospel, which begin, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then John goes on to say, and everything has come into being through the Word, which is to say that everything essentially is an expression of God. Everything is essentially a living utterance of the One. And a couple of years ago, pre-pandemic, definitely, I was giving a talk in Virginia, and I was speaking of everything essentially being an utterance of God. And one of the participants came up to me at the end and he said, now, is there a relationship between the word utter and the word uterus? And I said, wow, I don't know that, but I think you're on to something. So the next time I could get my hand on my Oxford English dictionary, I did some etymological sort of digging. And sure enough, the word utter is derived from the Latin uterus. So to say that we are all utterances of God is to say that everything has come from the uterus of God. And not just our souls, but our bodies, and not just us as individuals, but the whole cosmos. It's all come forth from the very uterus, or come forth from the very womb, from the very heart, from the very essence of God. So there's that practice as well, paying attention reverently to the small book and to the big book, as the Celtic teachers put it, and to listening in stereo, and to doing that with others, and to see that utterance as a living, forever fresh utterance. And the other thing relates to the School of Earth and Soul, which I founded, and originally called the School of Celtic Consciousness, in which we give a lot of attention to study as well as spiritual practice as part of how we keep remembering, and again, to do this in the context of others, to study together, to go back to teachers that have been neglected. And this is part of what we do on our Iona pilgrimage weeks as well. So these, that's not to say that's the only way to move forward, but it's the way that it's an example of the way that I think we're all being invited to remember our true essence as being of God, that we need to find these simple spiritual practices, both on our own and together. We need to educate our minds as well as our hearts. And we are to see this combination of spiritual practice and study as more deeply equipping us for the holy work of love and the holy work of compassion, because that's the true mark of any great spiritual tradition.
Yeah. Wow, that is a lot to take in. My mind is reeling right now. But one of the things that you said early on, you talked about remembering. And I think for me, and I know for your tradition as well, a lot of our listeners, the problem, so to speak, that Jesus came to solve was a sin problem. But the way you're sharing it with us is that it's a memory problem. It's a forgetfulness problem. And one of the things I'm trying to do is remind myself of that on a daily basis. And one of the ways I do that, just thinking about it while you're talking, is my daughter is 4, and she's always asking me to tell her the story of Jesus. And I remember the first time she asked me that, she was like 2.5 maybe. And, in my mind, I'm like, well, I could just kind of give her a very abbreviated version because I don't have it figured out myself yet, and kind of steer clear of all of the problematic things that I picked up in my life. And inside of me, something said, and I think it was like just a smaller version of myself said, you gotta figure out how you're going to share this with her off the bat, because she's going to grow up and she's going to hear the stuff that you heard. And you want her to have this picture of Jesus that, she can hear something that maybe is, like the God is angry theology, and something in her will go off to, no, it's not the Jesus that I know. So I'm trying to figure out, how am I going to share this with her? And now, a 1.5 years later, it's every night I share the story with her, and I talk to her about how, God created everybody to be everybody good, everybody loving, create everybody to be loving and kind, all these different things. But over time, we forgot how to live. And so God said, oh, it looks like my people forgot how to live. I have to remind them. And so God came to live inside of Jesus, and Jesus reminded us of who we were. And lots of people woke up, and lots of people began to follow him. They were called his disciples. Some people didn't wake up, but we kind of go through this story, and then that reminds me on a daily basis. So that's reminding me, Daddy, who doesn't have it all figured out, but is constantly reminding me of that new narrative that I'm trying to really cement into my mind, because that old narrative is very much still there. And I'm trying to kind of juggle these two things and figure it out as I go. So to your point, I think just having those different practices that remind us of this different narrative of God than many of us were handed is really, really important. And for me, it's just laying in bed with my 4-year-old at the end of the day, thinking about the story of Jesus.
Yeah, beautiful. That's a beautiful account of what you're doing in your fatherhood, and that to me is, that is the practice of spirituality. It's how we work it through in these essential and sacred relationships of our lives. And the questions that our children ask us, the questions that now my grandchildren are asking me, are formative questions. They, it's out of the mouths of babes that we're often being invited to pay closer attention to. What is our vision? How do we articulate it? I've been spending a bit of time again here in Scotland with the writings of one of my favorite Scottish poets, Edwin Muir, same spelling as John Muir, the great ecologist, but another man from the Orkney Islands. And one of the things he says in one of his poems, and then expands on in a letter that I've had access to, he says, truth is not too complicated for expression. He says it's too simple for expression. And the simpler we can be in our utterances and expressions, he says, that is usually an indication that we're getting closer to the heart of truth. And I think that's so true. And the story of Jesus welcoming the children, this is not just, it is of course literally speaking about the importance of children, but I think it's also inviting us to access the childlike within ourselves, right, and to keep allowing ourselves to return to that beauty of simplicity that is in the heart and eyes and ears of a child.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Well, JP, we are just about out of time. I've already kept you longer than I said I was going to, but I can't stop listening to you.
It's been great to speak.
So maybe we can do this again sometime. But before you go, where's the best place for people to connect with you online in your work?
Yeah, thank you. I do have a website called Earth and Soul. So that's just EARTHANDSOUL.org. And that provides an indication of the things I've been writing and working on. It also has an event schedule of pilgrimages and the School of Earth and Soul. So that's a good place to go, and there's a way of getting a message through to me if you want to.
That's how I found you.
Great.
And he does answer. He answered me. Awesome. Well, JP, thank you again so much. And I'll put all those links in the show notes, and hopefully we can do this again sometime.
Yeah, great. Blessings to you, Glenn.
Thanks, my friend. Thank you.